So welcome everyone. Welcome to today's MeCCSA Policy Network event. And I believe it's good afternoon to all. I think we are all based on the same continent. My name is Michalis. I am a reader in communication policy at the University of Westminster, and I'm co-vice chair of the MeCCSA Policy Network. The entire policy network team is here with us. The other vice chair is Jonathan Hardy. The chair is Phil Ramsey, and Paul Rayleigh is our social media and publicity officer. The event is being recorded, and by joining, you give your consent to be recorded, and we plan to post the recording online at a later stage, and we'll post the details on the MeCCSA distribution list. I am delighted to be chairing today's event, and I'd like to give a warm welcome to our speaker, Tom Chivers. Tom will soon become formally Dr. Tom Chivers. He's waiting for everything to be signed off. Tom did an ESRC-funded PhD at Goldsmiths, where he was also associate lecturer in media history and politics. He's lectured on the Levenson Inquiry and press reform at Bournemouth University. And he's been a researcher for the Media Reform Coalition, currently working on media ownership. And he also worked with the 2015 Future of Television Inquiry. Today, Tom will speak about the past, present, and future of BBC policy making. It's an extremely current topic. He'll speak for about 25 to 30 minutes, and after that, we'll open it up for discussion, comments, and questions. And we have plenty of time for that. So I, for one, cannot wait to hear what he has to say. So, Tom, the screen is all yours. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Maria. Is my PowerPoint front and centre for everybody?
Yes.
Excellent. Great. Well, thank you. Well, thank you also to Phil and the MeCCSA Policy Network team for organising this session today. And most of all, thank you to all of you here in the call for coming. So just as a brief summary of my research, as Maria said, I've recently finished my PhD on media policy making in the UK, and that's been analysing the debates and processes that shape government decisions on media policy. And what I've been particularly interested in this is what the policy-making process can tell us about the dynamics of power within our media system. So that's sort of questions like, who is able to influence policy? How is decision-making organised as a political activity? What are the values and ideas that inform policy change? And how do changes in policy impact on how our media systems work? And so for today, I'm just going to detail some of my research into BBC policymaking in particular, and look at what its recent history can tell us about the dynamics of power at play in the emerging debates on the future of public service broadcasting in the UK. Well, to say it's a interesting time to be talking about BBC policy is probably the understatement of the century. I guess that's not just because next year was going to mark the BBC's 100th anniversary. So we've seen a lot of new appointments at the head of the corporation recently, which I think have highlighted the BBC's fragile political independence and demonstrate in particular the Conservative Party's attempts to cement their influence over BBC strategy. So here we have Tim Davie, a former Conservative councillor who was recently appointed as BBC Director General in the summer. We have Richard Sharp, the former City banker and Conservative Party mega donor, who the government appointed as chair of the BBC board just a few weeks ago. And in April, the government will choose the next chair of the media regulator, Ofcom. And if we're to believe press reports and government briefings, then it's Paul Baker, the former editor of the Daily Mail and arch enemy of the BBC, who seems to be Boris Johnson's #1 choice to take up the post. To add to this, the BBC has had its public funding squeezed by almost 30% since 2010 and has had to scrap the free licenses for over 75s to avoid paying or to avoid a potential loss of over £700 million if it were to keep the scheme going. We've also seen a swathe of cuts in BBC programming and staff, with 450 regional journalists up for the chop, and a recent BBC report just from last month suggesting that there's a further 400 million of cuts coming in the next year. We've also seen pressure building in the wider broadcasting market. Soon we're going to have 2 new right-wing TV news channels due to launch with overt strategies to undermine the BBC. BBC's locked in competition with streaming giants. There's major questions around bias, balance and reporting. And it's struggling to appeal to youth audiences and so on, a whole ream of challenges. Well, as if all of that weren't bad enough, there's going to be 3 official policy events due to take place next year, which I think have the potential to set the BBC on an irreversible decline. First, we have the BBC's first ever midterm charter review, which is going to expose the BBC to renewed political interference. Now, the government says that this review will not change the BBC's core purpose or funding, but this review will nonetheless coincide closely with the recently begun renegotiations over the licence fee. And this is before even considering whether the licence fee will continue to exist in its current form. The government may have shelved its review from last year of its plans to decriminalise the licence fee, but I think perhaps the midterm review and funding negotiations may prove far too tempting as a pretext for a total overhaul of how the BBC is funded. And what I've noticed over the course of these 2 recent debates is that there seem to be kind of 2 the general accounts of how these future battles of the BBC will unfold. And the first is the kind of apocalypse scenario, which is that the Conservative government, cheered on by the press and by anti-BBC lobbying groups, will defund the BBC or tear up its public service foundations. And the second account suggests that although the government probably enjoys banging the BBC drum quite heavily, in reality, the appetite for an existential showdown is quite light. The government and the BBC are probably going to sluggishly mediate some sort of punitive reform that satisfies the critics while generally preserving the next couple of years of the BBC's future. Now, both of these accounts, I think, have precedent in recent patterns of BBC policymaking, but more importantly, they reveal the wider perceptions about how BBC policymaking works, which is just how far separated the public is from having a meaningful involvement in decisions on public service media. And so part of what I want to argue today is that we can understand a lot about how these impending debates will play out by looking at the methods, the behaviours and the biases that past decisions have established as routine features of modern BBC policymaking. I think what's important is that rather than us being stranded as noisy agitators or kind of impotent spectators in BBC policy, it's important that we expose these entrenched dynamics of power that structure the decision-making process, and then in the process equip ourselves with the means to intervene in the hugely significant debates to come. So, although the midterm review and the licence fee negotiations may be over a year away, and the BBC's next full charter review isn't due until 2027, I still think that the terms on which these future debates on the BBC will be decided are already being set right now. So before I talk about recent patterns, I'll just try and very briefly outline some of the enduring political trends in the longer history of BBC policymaking. I think the main thing to point out here is that there's never really been any golden age where decisions about the BBC were made openly or democratically with genuine public or even parliamentary involvement. Charter review was often a kind of understated affair, kept as a matter of private bureaucratic bargaining between government elites on one side and a handful of elite BBC governors and executives on the other. And in that sense, not really that much has changed today. Well, the introduction of commercial television in 1955 and the introduction of Channel 4 in 1982 were products of lengthy, stoic inquiries staffed by eminent figures, yet their findings were subject to the political interpretations of the government of the day. And the laws and regulations that these reports eventually led to were also closely influenced by the behind-the-scenes activities of a growing commercial lobby. And then from the 1980s onwards, the BBC Board of Governors became increasingly politicised. Marmaduke Hussey, who was Margaret Thatcher's appointment for BBC chair, proved to be particularly sympathetic to the government and usefully hostile to the BBC, pushing out 2 director generals who had conflicted with the government and instituting a new commercial-inspired regime in BBC production and management. So the broader trend here is that power within the BBC moved away from programme makers and shifted up to a sort of growing retinue of managers and executives, while the government continued to exercise a constant top-down pressure through appointments and funding freezes. That's obviously quite an oversimplified account of nearly 80 years of policymaking, but hopefully it shows some of the core political dynamics that have existed throughout the BBC's history. And in my view, some of the most important practices and processes that define BBC policymaking today were actually introduced by policy decisions of the Blair government in the early to mid-2000s. This government was particularly inspired by an influential think tank report, which was funded in part by private media companies who were eager to expand into lucrative new markets. And through this, New Labour created the super regulator Ofcom with a legal duty and a central mission to promote market competition in the media. And probably the most residual effect of this is that Ofcom's new regulatory regime laid the groundwork for future governments to impose increasingly stringent market constraints on the BBC, which, as we'll see, is precisely what happened in the last Charter Review in 2016. The Charter Review process in 2005 and 2006 also formalised a new standard of elite BBC decision-making structured around this kind of commercial interpretation of public service and designed to deliver commercial goals. The government appointed an expert Charter Review panel led by Treasury economist Paul Burns. And from the panel's findings, the government adopted the bits it liked, such as criticising the Board of Governors for its failure to deliver value for money, while ignoring the findings that it didn't like, namely the particularly radical recommendation that there should be an independent commission created to insulate the BBC's governance and funding from political interference. The government's Green Paper during this Charter Review, the consultation, received over 5,000 responses, but the public was effectively asked to merely comment on changes that the government had already decided to make, rather than actually asking the government to contribute to decision-making themselves. So there were two major changes introduced by the renewed 2006 Charter that have reshaped the BBC's regulation in subtle but significant ways. Firstly, the BBC's public service mission was restated in the form of 6 official public purposes, which I've included here. And then there was a new sort of arsenal of public value tests and market impact assessments that any new or changed BBC service would be subjected to. And I think this shift to quantitative reviews and market-conscious intervention not only opened the BBC services to regular accusations of bloating from its agitated rivals, more fundamentally, it reinterpreted the BBC's core Reithian values, that is, to inform, to educate and to entertain, as measurable criteria within an increasingly commercialised regulatory culture. Perhaps even more interestingly, the original impetus for these new regulatory tools came from the BBC itself. The corporation's Charter Review manifesto, which was titled Building Public Value, articulated a new theory of public sector administration that saw the public as consumers who expected choice, efficiency and value for money, rather than treating them as citizens with collective social and cultural interests. I think this is one of the earliest demonstrations of an especially worrying power dynamic in contemporary BBC policymaking, which is the BBC preemptively reforming itself and offering ritual policy concessions to try and stave off government intervention or commercial criticism, but in doing this ultimately accepting changes that have further diminished its public service mission and its independence. And this brings us to the beginnings of the last Charter renewal process in 2015. And for today, I want to home in on 4 themes which I feel best illustrate how the most recent Charter Review has normalised particular power relations through taken for granted rules and behaviours of BBC policymaking. And the first theme concerns the so-called Charter Review cycle. And the idea here is that because every Royal Charter is given an expiry date, it starts at this date and it ends at this date, then Charter renewal becomes a predictable routine event with a defined beginning, middle and end. And this is certainly how government policymakers present the formal Charter process. John Whittingdale, who was the Culture Secretary during the last Charter Review, said it was essential that this process, this cycle, be put in place in order to separate BBC policy from the political cycle and enhance the independence of the BBC. And I've included here a slightly blurry government infographic, which sort of gives you the idea of the government's own perceived roadmap for the decisions and deliberations it would go through as part of Charter Review. Well, the irony is that I think the formal routine of Charter Review is precisely what exposes the BBC to government meddling and political interference. And that's not just during official consultations and negotiations, but throughout the entire decade-long charter period. And as the years from 2007 show, really a new charter review basically begins as soon as the last charter review ends. With, from that point on, competing policy interests are fighting to establish the core terms of debate that will define the substance of future policy issues. Now, obviously, during the sort of 2007 to 2016 charter period, BBC was beset by crises, revelations of endemic sexual abuse by the deceased presenter Jimmy Savile, the failure of the £100 million digital media initiative, and damning reports by the National Audit Office on the BBC's £25 billion spent on staff severance. Now, these are obviously, worrying failures, not a good look for the BBC, although they're not especially unusual for large public organisations or media groups. But the prevailing interpretation of these events as matters of policy was driven by politicians and newspapers with consistently anti-BBC views and editorial lines, who metabolised these scandals into irrefutable examples of BBC waste, of an institutional culture of complacency, and of the diminishing rationale for its public funding. And the amplified BBC bashing in the national press clearly served its purpose, as whether by actually convincing policymakers of deep-seated problems or simply by providing them with the political ammunition for their existing plans, radical reform of the BBC's governance and regulation became the starting position of the incipient debates on the forthcoming charter review. And before the government had even prepared its draft proposals for the Green Paper consultation, it appeared as though abolition of the BBC Trust, which had only just been created in the last charter review in 2006, was now a foregone conclusion. So clearly, media agenda setting plays a major role in any policy debate. So by the time the public consultations were published in 2015, the range of issues that the public were invited to consider and the possible solutions available to them had already been determined through this kind of elite lens of media political commentary. And obviously this is a space that's hardly renowned for its close connections with the nuanced collective views of the public at large. And also this early stage of sort of informal BBC policymaking was out in the public eye, but not conducted with public engagement. And now that the charter review cycle has been cut in half by the forthcoming midterm review, I think we're likely to see an acceleration in and an intensifying of this kind of hostile media agenda setting on the subject and substance of BBC policy debate. And you only really need to look at any newspaper to see how that's already taking place. The second thing I want to talk about is the drastic imbalance of power between the BBC and the government during funding negotiations, and the longer-term impact that these settlements have had on both the BBC's finances and on its policy-making behaviour. And this is obviously already quite a well-trod territory, so I won't go into too many of the financial details today. But as a specific domain of BBC decision-making, these deals seem to have their own kind of bizarre logic and distorted power relationships. Negotiations are mostly conducted through private bartering between BBC executives and the government, with no public scrutiny of the deal or how it is made until it's already been agreed by the two parties. And although the BBC at times has been prepared to publicly oppose government demands, this brinkmanship has typically resulted in the BBC still accepting smaller liabilities as a way of staving off more damaging financial shocks. In 2010, the BBC managed to persuade the government against making it pay for over 75 licences by agreeing to a 6-year funding freeze and paying for a number of other services. But in 2015, having already traded away its financial security, BBC negotiators were effectively helpless to stop the new majority Conservative government, whipped up by an emboldened anti-BBC campaign following the election, from imposing that £700 million cost of the scheme onto the corporation's books. And bizarrely, the Director General publicly declared that the settlement was the right deal for the BBC, which I think is another case of the corporation kind of ritualistically surrendering itself to government interference. The third theme of BBC policymaking that I want to talk about today is the questionable role of public opinion and expert evidence in informing government decisions. Now, the Green Paper consultation in 2015 was possibly one of the largest ever public evidence gathering exercises, but the phrasing of its central questions took for granted that the BBC already had a negative market impact and that its output needed to be made more distinctive through regulation. Respondents were Respondents were asked questions like, is the expansion of BBC services justified, and what reforms could improve the BBC's content? But despite framing the entire consultation around the government's preferred marketised view of BBC's purposes, it's uncertain whether policymakers were even interested in what the public had to say about their plans. The Radio Times magazine, for example, alleged that Charter Review officials had never even requested the password to unlock the USB device containing their readers' responses. And when it was announced that over 90% of the 190,000 submissions had been organised via the 38 Degrees website, the group was derided as a left-wing renter mob hijacking government business. Well, instead of celebrating this massive public interest in a pivotal debate on public media, policymakers instead felt that in the interest of balance, government must conduct further polling and focus groups. More studies, reviews and research were needed to add technical expertise and independence from governments. And I think from this we can see how the public has been formally organised out of decisions on the BBC. And consultation is seen at best as a kind of nice gesture to the idea of open policy making, or at worst it's seen as a messy distraction which only produces subjective, uninformed responses. So what did the government's sudden drive for balance and expertise look like? Well, Charter Review featured a complete deluge of studies, opinion polls, market evaluations, commissioned by both the government and the BBC from a number of independent research agencies and influential private consultancies. It's not practical today to detail all of the different statistical claims and methodologies these reports contained. But I think the more important point here is that how the use of these market assessments has idealised an elite method of policy formulation that naturally privileges a market competition interpretation of public service broadcasting. I think this practice is one of the more tangible residual effects of the broader market paradigm in UK media policy that's been built up over the last 2 decades. Measuring markets and quantifying audiences is considered to be more useful to decision makers than a deeper, nuanced, but probably quite difficult interrogation of media's role in society. And it also shows this trend of what you might call policy-based evidence making that characterises the ostensibly public spaces of Charter Review. So policymakers set the goals and outcomes that they want from a policy process and then design processes that legitimise the answers they need with weighty evidence and statistics. And so the last theme I want to talk about today concerns the naturalisation of lobbying as a central feature of BBC policymaking. And I think what all the recent debates show is that the basic mechanisms of government deliberation on BBC policy have become increasingly susceptible to the influence of commercial media organisations. Now, of course, in all areas of public policy, lobbying is prevalent. Competing private interests will try and persuade policymakers to implement things that favour their own interests. But what has struck me while researching BBC policy is how all of the various regulatory changes, political tactics, and the homogenising values that have been compounded over the last 2 decades have progressively naturalised the role of commercial media lobbyists within the most intimate and significant decision-making processes. Well, first of all, there's a culture of elite insularity in our policy-making institutions. Media lobbyists become special advisors become politicians become ministers, and then when those ministers resign, they end up being hired back as commercial lobbyists, and suddenly they've got intimate knowledge and extensive connections in the elite world of media policymaking. So in the last Charter Review, we saw Ray Gallagher, a former Sky TV executive, appointed as the Culture Secretary's special advisor. We also saw the formation of the Charter Review Advisory Group, stuffed with executives from the BBC's rivals, but with just one figure representing the interests of licence fee payers. Secondly, there are informal lobbying behaviours that have normalised regular, private, unaccountable interactions between decision makers and commercial lobbyists. Lobbyists from some of the UK's biggest commercial broadcasters and industry trade associations enjoy a degree of insider access that is simply unavailable to other non-media or non-elite actors engaged in Charter Review. But there's also an emerging trend of governments consulting so closely with these groups that they end up deferring important deliberations and decisions on BBC policy to commercial stakeholders. And we saw this sort of most particularly in 2016, when the government privately asked PACT, the Independent Producers Association, to approve its plans for opening 100% of BBC commissioning to competition. Now, the BBC's own plans for BBC Studios already involved the scrapping of the 50% so-called in-house guarantee. But by seeking out the consent of the growing independent commercial sector, the government was more than happy to further diminish the BBC's production arm. There are the formalised policymaking practices which have embedded commercial influence at the heart of both charter renewal and the BBC's regulation. So the contents of the government's authoritative white paper are fiercely contested between policymakers, the BBC and commercial groups. And in 2016, key passages of its recommendations were effectively copy and pasted, and in some cases even copy and pasted verbatim from proposals that had been written by ITV and Sky. And so the concept of distinctiveness, the requirement that the BBC not tread on the toes of its commercial competitors, was given its practical meaning as a regulatory concept and as a top-level public purpose through this same lobbying over the minute wording of the draft Royal Charter clauses. The 2016 Charter also extended Ofcom's regulatory command over the BBC, giving it full responsibility for regulating the extent of the BBC's purposes and their impact on the market. The so-called public value test was strengthened as competition assessments, the phrase public value having clearly fallen out of vogue in the last 10 years, and the criteria for Ofcom to intervene in BBC services was softened, making it far easier for commercial broadcasters to request that Ofcom intervene where they felt they were losing out. And this commercial culture has normalised the commercial interests of the BBC's competitors in official decision-making processes. But even more dangerously, I think it's naturalised a deep imbalance of power between, on the one hand, the public rituals of charter renewal, the consultations and the speeches and the parliamentary debates, and then on the other side, the private practices through which the real substantive decisions on policy are made. Which brings us back quite neatly to the present day and the upcoming policy crises facing the BBC. But given these historical patterns of increasing commercial capture, constant political assaults and diminishing public service values, it's probably quite reasonable to ask, well, how the hell has the BBC survived the last 10 years, let alone the last 100? I think in some sense, part of this is down to the fact that there's a significant inter-elite relationship between the BBC and the state, which we can see across many aspects of its reporting, its public image, its bureaucratic culture. But this does also give the BBC an institutional standing and a kind of tradition of influence in the corridors of power. We also can't ignore the fact that policymakers do see value in a large national media organisation, even if what that value is clearly changes between governments. And quite apart from them policymakers simply enjoying wielding the authority to shape, steer and cajole the BBC, politicians do acknowledge that it has a significant political and cultural capital. And I think this explains in some way why recent policies have taken the kind of wither on the vine strategy for weakening public service broadcasting, rather than engaging in a costly political standoff to destroy it altogether. So for those of us interested in reclaiming public media, I think first of all we need to avoid falling into this kind of politicized cycle of attack, reform and decline that has characterized much of the BBC's recent history. Obviously, we all have our deep interests and research perspectives on things like decriminalisation and BBC appointments, but they sort of form their individual parts of a wider pattern, which I think is more important than the politics of the day. I think we also need to mobilise in support of a genuinely open and democratic approach to public decisions on the BBC, whether that be introducing new statutory requirements on how charter review takes place, or securing the way that funding decisions are made. Now, clearly, these reforms are easier said than done, and they need extensive planning and a very open, soul-searching debate on what public service actually means in the 21st century. But just for today, I hope I've given some insight into a particular way of understanding some of the features of BBC policymaking, and I look forward to discussing it more and taking any of your questions. So thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Tom. That was fascinating. You managed to cover so much of the BBC's nearly 100 years in 25 minutes.
Sorry,
Well
it has to be crammed in, so
no,
sorry
but
for...
it was very clear, to the point. Right. So now we can open it up to discussion. So who wants to go first? Comments, observations? You can either raise your hand or unmute your mic. And Natalie.
Hi, Tom and everyone. Great talk, Tom. As you know, I love your work. And you did a wonderfully eloquent presentation. I have a question, I guess, about kind of going beyond the BBC. And we're always caught up in this save the BBC rhetoric, when actually what we're talking about is public media. Per se, and whether you see any openings, and I think partly that's the problem, is it's all focused on the BBC. And actually the debate needs to be widened and broadened in order to think more carefully about what a truly democratic, representative, accountable public media ecology might look like. And so I was wondering whether you just had any sense of how we would go about doing that, partly because we're involved in trying to do that right now, but also kind of, whether you think there are any available openings in the sort of, because you've analysed this in such depth, where would you go to prise that door open?
Sure. Well, I think, as you've just said, it's partly an issue of framing. And something that's been stuck in my head recently is the way sort of debate needs to move on from talking about saving the BBC to saving a BBC, in the sense that, there are bits of the BBC we like, there are bits of the BBC that have clearly had historical and institutional difficulties and issues that we need to reform and change. But reforming and changing those doesn't need to come with this kind of emotive attachment to the BBC as a, sort of historical organisation. As you say, it's more about what can we do to reform, whether it's a BBC or a new wider sense of public media. I mean, there are obviously lots of different proposals for that in terms of, introducing a new sort of digital media corporation that has a similar basis to the BBC, but is focused more on expanding the ideals of public service into digital media and online media. There's ideas around the sort of wide democratization of the commissioning process, in the sense that you take commissioning away from sort of aloof BBC wonks and you give it back to the public. You create means through which the public can say, we'd like to see programs about this. We'd like to see services that do that. So I think, yes, your point is absolutely right, that the focus needs to shift to, beyond the BBC and to a BBC, or just to public media in general. And the interesting thing is that, those two things don't really need to be separated, because the BBC is part of public media. So when we're talking about potential reforms to the BBC or potential proposals for expanding public media, we sort of don't need to have it as an either or option, partly because that's, if we take the either or option, that's a very useful political framing that I'm sure the Conservatives would love. They say, well, if you're happy, we can get rid of the BBC and make something else. But, if we're actually looking for an expansive, universal, publicly aimed media system, then there's lots of things we can do. It's about giving a kind of holistic vision for it that's more focused towards public media rather than just this organisation or that.
I guess it's that organisational focus, which I understand, because, of course, the BBC has become so iconic in so many ways. But, I mean, this is a complete aside, and this is just me because I was so shocked, and I watched it today. Have any of you seen the Rishi Sunak video that BBC have put out today? It is unbelievably awful. It's like a government propaganda video on Rishi Sunak, and it's got all of the big journalists coming out and saying what a lovely guy he is and how wonderful he is, and how, it's just kind of, why do they do that to themselves all the time? It's like, so, it's kind of, and I'm sure in a couple of days they'll take it down. It's the same as when they had him as Superman.
Yeah.
Right. It's exactly in that mold. And I kind of feel like they're playing the game too hard, and they're going to become really unstuck. And so we're almost doing them a favour by shifting the focus, saying, okay, let's talk about public media. Let's really broaden the agenda and make them fight for their position in that as public media. Not so, I'm kind of, every now and again I think, no, we've just got to defend the BBC, and then I see something like
they don't make it easy, do they?
Oh my God, what are they doing? Anyway, I'll stop ranting and I'll let.
Well, I think that's a really important point, because there are two things going on there. First is that, as we know, the government's control of funding and the government's control of the charter renewal makes BBC executives very anxious. BBC executives and BBC managers are very anxious about what they do and how it will change what the government does when charter review or funding negotiations come around. That's one side of it. The other side, as I say, is there is just an elite culture within the BBC that is close connections with the Conservative Party, if not just Conservative politics more generally. Richard Sharp, the new chair, couldn't be any greater display of that. But even within, their journalism departments and their news production and their programme production, there is still this mindset of, a kind of insular conservative attitude to the purposes of news and, what the sort of framing of news should be, the conceptions of the way the economy works, the way that climate change should be considered as a debate. This isn't my field, but I've read enough of other people's research to see that across all of these different fields of debate, there is a consistent conservative tinge in the way the BBC works and the way it talks about the world. The difficulty in terms of reform and trying to drag the issue back to public media is then saying, well, how do you reform that sort of murky, pervasive culture without sort of conceding to this idea of, we need to just scrap one thing and build it anew? Very, very difficult. But, I guess in a sense, separating those two parts and saying, there's a problem with news values and production values, but then there's also still that overriding structural problem of the way the BBC's broader policy is controlled exclusively by government.
Exactly. I mean, it has to be made independent, entirely independent, in order for it to really genuinely serve the public interest and not the government interest. But anyway, I'm shutting up now.
Thank you. Sylvia, do you have a question? Yes, yes. You are muted.
All right.
Okay, now yes, we can hear you.
This is such a difficult one. I mean, essentially, we live in a two-party system, and have done for quite a long time. And I think both things are true. It is both true. Sorry, I don't mean about parties. I mean about what's to be done about democratisation. It is both true that a lot more effort should go into creating structures that might allow for broader public discussion. Yeah. And, for example, the sort of shameful trampling on the media studies in schools. I mean, that is something to be, really, it's a precious thing. And, I mean, I'm not a school teacher, but I would strongly support school teachers who wanted to do more work on trying to ensure that kids in schools had an opportunity to think about, for the whole of the rest of their lives, how they might have some influence in relationship to the big beasts. I think to advocate sort of just ushering the big beasts off the stage, to me, that's just not a very realistic. So I suppose I'm pragmatic in that sense. But I don't think that necessarily means one isn't also principled. I think there's been a bit of an underestimation about the slow, steady slog of how you get purchase on the institutions. And for example, looking at the relationship between the Lords Committee on Communications and the Commons Committee on Select Committee on the DCMS Committee, they are different, and it is possible to play on that and to make use of that. So I just urge a sort of, on the one hand, talk about the principles of how greater numbers of people might get more effectively involved in outcomes, and also playing the game of the present which is the game of power and thinking about how you can make changes. I mean, take the example of the new board that replaced the old trust.
Yep.
First there was the governors and then there was the trust, and now there's a board. Well, for people who were watching it closely, really it was like fighting in the streets, you know. I mean, post by post, there was a big struggle going on about how would this appointment take place. And it's no surprise to find that the board members, England, Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland, are probably slightly less part of the Westminster purview, sadly, with the exception of England, in my opinion. But anyway, I'm sorry, you see what I'm trying to say? That
yes. Well, the
point about change and horses for courses, and think about how you make change now, not just in 20 years' time.
Yes, certainly. Well, the point about the trust is interesting because although, you know, people didn't consider it particularly effective, the trust did have a duty to consult with licence fee payers. The reason it was introduced as that kind of new structure of governance is that, you know, the Charter Review in 2006 found that licence fee payers didn't think the BBC was listening to them. So they introduced the trust as a way of going out into the country, setting up all these kind of different networks and meeting areas where they would go and speak to licence fee players. Probably wasn't as effective as it could have been, but at least for the time sort of introduced the idea that the BBC, you know, this idea of we're listening to licence fee payers through polling or through newspaper reports, you know, that the trust at least had the idea that listening to licence fee payers meant going out into the country and speaking to people and engaging in, you know, like I see you shaking your head because you know that it wasn't very effective at doing that. But the idea of doing that was very important. And then, of course, when the trust was scrapped, there isn't anybody left within the BBC that kind of has that explicit duty to go and do that. On the point of politics and the kind of reform of the present, I agree that, you know, when we say beyond the BBC, we're not talking about sort of getting rid of the BBC. We're about taking the good and blowing it up and making it better and expanding it into new areas. And on the two-party system stuff, we're sort of unfortunately stuck in a bind where, first of all, we don't really know what the Labour Party position is on media reform. They kept quiet when decriminalisation came up. There were kind of piecemeal statements on shouldn't be doing this now, listen to the Perry review from 2015. But there wasn't any real sort of grand statement of intent of this is what the Labour Party would do in that position. Now it's under a new leadership. We're stuck in a bit of a position where we sort of the best way to appeal to, you know, a kind of progressive reform in the BBC by going through the Labour Party is to take some of those like kind of commercial framing of the BBC and saying, oh, you know, it's a great contributor to the economy. It trains up production. It trains up journalists. It makes great big collaborations of all these different groups. We may be stuck, although our grander plan is to advocate for the expansion of public media. It may be that the way we preserve the BBC is to say, well as public media being a good thing, look at all the clear economic benefit that the BBC brings through just sheer investment in media industries. The fact that there is great big public investment in training up journalists, training up producers, commissioning all different types of content, that's a good thing on its own. And it's, you know, potentially a useful kind of political wedge to get into the minds of policymakers who are more concerned about those things. But it's also useful in service of our broader arguments to say public media and public investment in media is good.
Okay, thank you. I've seen you, Des. There is also some activity in the chat, and there is a question by Neil Washburn. He's wondering about how to reclaim that democratic policy making, in particular for popular BBC services, such as pop music radio, and especially ones that address younger audiences.
Yes,
so I don't know if
I can make a short comment to say I do think that's essential, and it goes back to my point about the sort of simmering ideas that were introduced by the Trust of actually going out and speaking to BBC audiences and asking them what they want and what they think. Dan Hind, his book on sort of the return of the public, talks a lot about public commissioning and the way you might establish sort of new institutions that are based in communities, based in local or regional settings, that actually, you know, they get their ideas for commissioning and distribution of funding from the public rather than a kind of stratified bureaucratic consultation system where we speak to some members of the public and then we amplify their views out. No, what you need is you create a system, a sort of network of commissioning, where you go out into communities and ask people what they think. And of course, you can do that by age, you can do that by all kinds of different demographic properties. If you want to expand the provision of public media in different areas, then you need to go and speak to those people you're looking to serve.
Thank you. Des?
Well, following up on that, thank you, Tom, for a great talk. Yeah, it's a pretty grim picture that you're painting. So I wanted to just listen to your answer about how we can actually change this grim picture and what the most effective ways into the policy process there are for public. So, I mean, you just said then the BBC should listen to more people, but they may listen formally speaking, but to what extent is there any guarantee they will act on it? You know, we just had a U-turn, as was fairly predictable at one level, over BBC Three. You know, is it a huge surprise that they have reinstated its linearity this morning, because they suddenly just discovered that not all 18 to 30-year-olds switched off linear, and that actually it was quite useful as a means of just, you know, incubating output. You know, I think had they listened to people to begin with, they may not have done that in the first place. So what are the routes? And then you've already talked about opinion polls, or what were you talking about? The letter writing campaigns that went in. I mean, they just disappear or they're dismissed. So what for you are the key ways in which we genuinely can start to see a difference start to see the executive actually listen to the publics in public service broadcasting?
Well, I think that's partly why today I've went through some of the sort of defining patterns of BBC policymaking, is because the more you look at them, the more you do actually find contradictions in the way those patterns work. And just to give an example, in the public purposes, there used to be a requirement that the BBC, I think the requirement was phrased something like to bring the world to the UK and the UK to the world. So the idea being that, you know, we bring lots of interesting arts and culture from outside, but we also take British culture and give it to the world. Now, in 2016, maybe some great big debate about the UK's place in the world happened in 2016. I'm not sure, but that public purpose was effectively scrapped. So the BBC no longer had a commitment to actually go and, you know, deliver the world to the UK. It was as if the idea that the UK public may be interested in what's happening beyond its shores had simply evaporated. But then even going with that, there's still this idea of kind of soft power of the BBC. And you probably hear this phrase all the time, mostly from sort of favourable backbench conservatives who say, oh, we might not like left-wing bias. However, it's very, very useful as the UK soft power abroad, where we have journalists representing kind of British diplomatic tradition and bringing liberal democratic values to countries that don't have them. So quite a, you know, clearly paternalistic view of the BBC. But my point here is that there is some, you know, these little contradictions and these little gaps within thinking about the BBC, which do give us routes to try and persuade backbench conservatives, build up coalitions with parliamentarians and saying, well, you know, left-wing bias and this stuff, it's dealt with regulation, and here's studies that show it's not that bad. But if you're interested in the BBC standing in the world and its soft power, that's a way to go and speak to these policymakers and say, well, we're on the same page as you. We think it's good that the BBC goes out into the world and makes a big kind of cultural interchange between the UK and everybody else. And there's sort of other examples like that in terms of the way that policymakers, they're sort of stuck in the mud on this idea of, you know, when they say, what do we do about the BBC? It's got such a great following. Well, that's true in that policymakers are a bit cowed by the idea that there are millions and millions of people who like it, and playing off of that, not in terms of just polling and letters, but saying that, you know, this isn't an esteem for Mrs. Brown Boys or Question Time. This is an esteem for the idea of public media and the idea that we own a stake in something. So I think particularly drawing on those contradictions in policymaking is probably, hopefully, a slightly more nuanced way of going about things, and not just, you know, public letter campaigns and, you know, social media and civil society work is important, but that should be building around a more sort of direct campaign to pierce ourselves into those sort of contradictions in the policymaking process.
Thank you. I'm picking up the questions from the chat. There is another question from David McQueen. Excellent talk. Do you want to instead of me. Do you want to speak, David? You're muted.
Right, hopefully I've unmuted myself. Fantastic talk, Tom.
Thank you, David.
Just, I mean, you picked up so many points, and what they all point to, I think, is the fact that the BBC is not independent of government. And I think, you know, Chris's work and Des's work and your work shows that really, really clearly. And it's got worse. It's got worse over time. It's got particularly bad under this government with this chairman as the latest example. And I know this is probably not your field, but are there other public service broadcasters around the world where we could say there's an example of a public service broadcaster which is genuinely independent from the government? And can we learn anything from other countries that we might say, look, you know, enough of this government, the long screwdriver, and it's not, and that long screwdriver is getting shorter and shorter. Is there a way we can sort of champion a slightly different model or a radically different model for the BBC, looking at other countries?
Well, as you say, that's not. I unfortunately haven't read too much work around the kind of specific structures and organisation of other public service broadcasters. I was particularly interested, though, and I wrote this as a piece for the LSE media blog, was on the German broadcasting levy. Was one particular reform that I think is potentially a very sort of important foundation that we might want to build on in terms of saying, well, clearly the licence fee derided, sort of despised by certain people, and there are clearly reasons of social equity why the licence fee as a kind of criminal compelled tax isn't a good idea. That doesn't mean we should get rid of public funding, just that there are problems with the licence fee. If we're looking to move beyond the licence fee, then a kind of system where there is a household levy which is collected or valued by some kind of independent commission, so a commission that's set up through law but has its appointments done. Part of my research was on the post-Leveson process, and there was an interesting strain of that which looked at how you can make appointments more independent. And it was basically an idea: you have layers and layers and layers of a panel appoints a panel, appoints an independent appointer who appoints another. You know, it goes on and on and on, basically as a way to, as far as possible, separate appointments from the government of the day. So you can have an independent commission which is the steward of the licence fee, adjudicates its value, decides on where concessions should be made for different groups in different financial situations. And that, you know, sort of borrowing from that German model, and I think there are some Nordic countries which also use that broadcasting levy or the household levy approach. I think that's one area where we may want to borrow things, but I'm sure there are other people in this chat who know far more about global PSB than I do.
Thank you. Before we move to, I see one comment from Christopher Roberts. I want to ask something. I know I'm chairing it, but it links nicely, I think, to what you've been saying. How do you see the Ofcom consultation on the future of public service broadcasting and this idea that they put forward that perhaps we can expand the concept and talk about public service media? So it links to what Natalie was saying earlier, but I'm not sure that they mean the same thing, yes? So I was wondering what you think of this consultation. And again, you know, it's in a way, it is a window of opportunity for us to do something and try and intervene, given the limitations that you mentioned in your presentation and how it's all elite and so on and so forth. But how do you see the Ofcom consultation?
I think it's an important review because it's the UK's main statutory regulator of media, and so its conclusions and its findings are important. The thing I seem to have found in the past is that although Ofcom's kind of regulatory functions are stuck within this commercial measurements approach, when it does the more qualitative reviews of broadcasting, it's generally quite good. You know, it's sort of still, it's stuck with that kind of baggage of, you know, what's the BBC's market impact and how can we improve investment and economic competition. But when it comes to those sort of ideals of public broadcasting, Ofcom seems on board. They're probably not enthusiastic, they don't come across as enthusiastic about them, but they're at least cognizant of why they're important. The issue with these reviews, I talked about it briefly in the presentation, is that while they have no kind of statutory bearing on BBC policy, what tends to happen is that when these reviews come out, sort of government bods somewhere give them a quick scan, or they hit Control F and search for decriminalisation or abolition or something. And then ministers will stand up in Parliament and say, well, Ofcom found that this bit's bad and this bit's bad and this bit's bad. So that confirms why we need to sort of reform the BBC radically. They'll very rarely look into the details of Ofcom and say, well, 97% of people use the BBC. It's the most popular and most trusted news source. You know, it's a sort of evidence pick and mix approach to those reviews, which I think is quite difficult. It will, as I say, be, as all their kind of public service reviews are, and their general reporting on these things, very, very interesting and very important for kind of setting or, you know, starting to percolate some of those ideas around what do we want for the future. But while they are, or while, you know, the core parts of BBC policymaking don't have any kind of statutory or structural basis, they're quite difficult, at least as far as I can see, it's quite difficult to think of a way that you can mobilise them into something that can genuinely affect the official decision-making process.
Thank you. Christopher Roberts, you have a comment in the chat. Do you want to?
Yeah, I did, but I think most of it's been sort of covered. I mean, I made that point angrily, as I often do, but most of the stuff has been covered, really. I suppose. Yeah, I mean, So
you're happy? Okay.
Yes, absolutely, it's fine.
Well, not happy, but
well, covered.
Yes.
Yeah.
Thanks. Okay, Phil and then Sylvia.
Well, thanks, Tom, for the brilliant paper and the brilliant presentation. And just to say on behalf of the whole network, a big thanks for coming along today and sharing that. Two questions from me. You talked towards the end of your presentation on possible new statutory requirements and how a charter review would better take place, along the lines of the kind of normative critiques you're making there. I mean, what might that look like? Would that go through Parliament as opposed to the government, or would that be through another body? And then the second question is actually on Ofcom as opposed to the BBC, although of course the two are linked. I mean, if Paul Dacre is appointed chair of Ofcom, as press briefings are suggesting that it's highly likely he will be, I mean, how high are the stakes around that happening, and what would happen next in your view? So two questions.
Sure. Well, on the first part, in terms of formalising more democratic approaches to charter review, it's interesting that some of those pieces are kind of already in place. You know, we do have, when I talked about the charter review cycle, the interesting thing is that although it's 10 years long and there's lots of different debates and conflicts, there are sort of rumblings of official deliberation within Parliament. So you have, you know, the Select Committee. I think they did two, well, at least the Commons Select Committee did two inquiries into charter review. The Lords did one. There was, you know, civil society action around those kinds of reviews. So at least in Parliament, those pieces are already in place. The problem is that they just don't have any, you know, statutory power, which is evidenced in particular that the first Commons Charter Review report was chaired by John Whittingdale, and it came out with conclusions saying, you know, the licence fee should never be decided in this way. It was decided brutally late at night. There needs to be a formal process. So John Whittingdale's signature was on that report with those recommendations, and then 2 years later, he's the Secretary of State who does exactly the same thing. So, as I say, the pieces are in place. It's just about finding a way, and it's, you know, again, it's one of those sort of massive wholesale reforms that needs to take place across the whole institutions of BBC policymaking. But, you know, there is precedent for select committees in Parliament to have their say and actually issue formal recommendations that should be accounted for in the green and white paper consultations. Parliament should have some form of vote, or at least some form of, you know, veto power or ability to intervene or investigate in certain aspects of it. Yeah, so I think that's. And the second part of your question was, it's escaped my. Oh, Paul Dacre and Ofcom. Yeah, so we have, you know, there used to be public value tests, now they're competition assessments, competition reviews. Depending on how Paul Dacre gets out of bed in the morning, it could be disastrous. You know, the whole reason that these tests have been devised and expanded to become kind of more and more commercially sensitive is that it now makes it possible for commercial lobbyists to go to Ofcom and say, the BBC's introduced this new service. we don't like it, we think it's treading on our profits, we want you as the regulator to go in and investigate it, if not just stop it altogether. With Paul Dacre in charge, he could completely reform the whole internal processes of Ofcom to make that even easier. I'm slightly less familiar, and I'm sure some of you in the chat are, in terms of the internal decision-making structures of Ofcom, you know, which committees make which decisions when it comes to making rulings on standards or regulation. Who is it? Who are the actual people who are there devising Ofcom's official response to these processes? But in the same tone, if you have the chair of the organisation who devises its strategy and the way it implements these processes, having Paul Dacre in that position just seems, you know, that the tools are already there. You just need somebody who's willing to swing them around in the BBC's direction.
Thanks. Sylvia?
Sorry. Sorry, what have I done? I just wanted to go back to the issue of public service media. And I appreciate that people in this meeting will disagree on this issue. But from my opinion is that the advocacy of public service media by the present government is a stalking horse for further reducing the BBC licence fee value. The one example that we have at the moment of a contested fund is the Fund for Children's Television, and some very interesting work's been done there. Yeah. But that money, guess where it came from? It was money that the government had taken off the BBC, but not managed to spend on what it said it was going to spend it on, broadband rollout and one or two other things. So that bit of money, that bit of spare change that was left in the back drawer of the DCMS got rerouted to create this contestable fund. But it was essentially licence fee payers' money. Yeah. And I think that it's a favourite of the Minister of State. Certainly believes strongly in the principle of contested funding. And I don't know whether Ofcom, I haven't looked at in detail at what they're saying about this, but I think Ofcom should be extremely careful about what it actually means. And I think we should be very careful about what it actually means as well.
Yeah, I think there's a very difficult distinction between making sure that public funding, whether it's collected through the licence fee or a levy or whatever, if we're talking about reform, obviously some of that public levy can't just all go to the BBC because we want to expand public media in different directions. And that's a good thing. But then the difficulty is, where do you draw the line between expansive public funding of different media opportunities and then, as you said, this kind of ring fencing and salami slicing where the licence fee is basically used for existing government spending commitments. You touched there, I think it was for the digital TV switchover, where the BBC was ordered to ring fence £600 million to deliver the digital TV switchover. And to the BBC's great credit, it did it in 400 million. And then rather than that money being given back to the BBC, you know, thank you for using your licence fee to pay for this, you can now have the remainder of the money back. The government then said, oh, well, you've saved money, we'll have that, thank you very much. And that's probably where some of this funding for the contestable thing came from. But I thought that was one of the strangest sort of quiet scandals of BBC policy, in a way, in that it was ordered to deliver a government spending commitment. It did it in an incredibly efficient way. And then the remaining money that it was supposed to commit was taken away from it. And that's licence fee payer money. That's our money, which was just sort of seconded by the government. So, I mean, you know, as you say, there's very difficult issues around it. But I think drawing that distinction between broad public funding with democratic public decisions on where that funding goes on the one hand, and then funding used for government purposes on the other, is quite difficult.
Thank you. Is it okay? There is a question from Neil Washburn. He is wondering who this we is, who want certain policy developments, expanded public service media. Is it a shared view among policy network members?
I don't want to speak too quickly. For
Perhaps we can give a thumbs up if we agree.
I think more of my point there is that most of us who are interested in media research and sort of interested in BBC policy, we're aware of these issues and why they're important and the sort of broader sort of historical reasons for public investment in media. We probably all disagree wildly on the way that these reforms should be implemented and what the kind of direction of future public media should be. But I think there is generally, when I use that kind of collective us, that collective we, I'm more just meaning those of us who sort of have an interest in this and see what's going on and are interested in what's going to happen next. Apologies to network members who don't think that's the case, but
Thank you. And I think we have to be careful with an expanded understanding of public service media, because we don't want a repeat of what's happening in Australia at the moment, where basically you have, funding from the big tech companies going to established commercial big media conglomerates. And that's the only ones who get funded. So they're getting stronger. Rather than trying to nurture new public service media, genuine public service media. So we have to be really careful what we mean with public service media if we move from public service broadcasting to public service media. Let me see, is there anything that I have missed? Anyone else with a question or comment? Jonathan?
Just a comment to compliment Thomas. Is a really excellent paper. There's a famous book by Helena Mancini called Comparing Media Systems, which tends to argue that some systems have good processes, legally driven, rational legal authority in their jargon, and other processes that are clientelist where states intervene. I think your research is very, very important to tell us how that binarism is false and that clientelism is alive and kicking inside the rational legal authority. And I think that comes across your analysis, the BBC and also Ofcom. So that's fantastic. But I also think your talk shows us how, you didn't use the jargon particularly yourself, but a new institutionalist approach, a neo-Gramscian approach, alerts us to both the analysis of contradictions and the resources within these institutions for counter-hegemonic forces. I thought it was very interesting to talk about youth and radio. Those are resources in the BBC, which is one reason why perhaps instead of tearing up an institution, we have to build on and build out and build beyond it.
Great, thank you. I agree. And particularly on the new institutionalism of the BBC. That was one of the things that I was sort of most interested and even excited in over the course of this research, was seeing that kind of the long-term trends and the way that all of these processes have built up. Because the presentation of policymaking is always that it's this sort of isolated process that takes place in a vacuum. One day a minister will decide, today we start the policy process. And, there's sort of there's no outside context or no outside influences. It just begins as this kind of hermetically sealed event. But what interested me was actually exposing how that's false and looking at particularly for the BBC, over 100 years, some of these processes and dynamics have been built up. And that's partly just a kind of personally fascinating historical phenomenon, but it's also important if we're trying to understand why BBC policymaking works the way it does today.
Thank you. Any other comments or questions?
I see Sylvia's hand up.
Sylvia, thank you.
I beg your pardon. I don't know if this is legitimate to raise this, but on the issue of public service more generally, I take the basic definition to be free at the point of use, whether we're talking about Channel 4 or BBC or whoever, And I don't know if many people here are aware that over the last 3 years, the whole spectrum delivery system that allows us to get through Freeview a number of channels, including Al Jazeera, by the way, that are free at the point of use. That spectrum re-engineering that's been going on, moving us from the 700 megahertz down to the 600 megahertz, that's the last place we've got to go for free-to-air broadcasting. And what motivated the move was the mobile interests requiring more and more spectrum. So we were pushed out in order to facilitate 5G. And you might say, well, that's all perfectly understandable. But the thing to worry about is what happens next. Because I think the government, at a certain point, assuming it maintains its large majority, will think about the mobile's interests in that next tranche of spectrum. And what will then happen is that the idea of universal availability free to air will sort of disappear. And I'm constantly surprised by the number of people that I talk to who don't know they've got a rooftop aerial. And it's only the rooftop aerial that's the guarantee that you can get it free.
I think that's particularly interesting where in the sort of 80s and 90s, the argument for expanding new commercial services is that look at all this great new spectrum that we've got available through new technologies. How can we still have the rationale for a public service broadcaster when there's so much more available technological space? And as you just said, it's all now being concentrated through sort of military use, mobile use, internet use. So almost ironically, we're going to end up back at the starting point where there's going to be a narrow, tiny band of spectrum available, which, as you say, will be the sort of last corner for public media.
Thank you. Anyone else? Any other questions or comments?
Can I just give a quick plug for our next seminar?
Yes.
I popped it into the chat there. So 21st of April at 3:45, we've got Declan McDowell-Naylor from Cardiff University, who I believe is on this call. And he is speaking on examining the content consumption and production of alternative online political media in the UK. So we'll be sending out registration details in due course, and it would be great to see everyone back here if you're interested for that talk in a few weeks' time. Thanks.
Thank you. Thanks, Phil. I see a raised hand. I'm not sure. Declan.
Oh, yeah. Can you hear me okay? Yep.
Yes.
I just, since my name was mentioned, just wanted to say hi to everyone and say thanks for the call out, and also to Tom for such a great talk. It's a very complex issue, and I didn't want to ask any questions because I didn't think it would do justice, but I will have a think and hopefully incorporate some of the things you said into the next talk, because there's a significant overlap between what you're researching and what we're researching at Cardiff as well. So hopefully I can do some of what you said justice in the next talk as well.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Looking forward to it.
Thanks.
So perhaps we can close today's event. A very, very big thanks to Tom. It was a fascinating presentation.
Oh, well, thank you. Thank you for your questions and discussion.
Food for thought and lots of work for those interested in public service media. So thank you for joining this MeCCSA Policy Network event, and we look forward to seeing you again at our next event on the 21st of April.